Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Business Management National 5 SQA Revision Support for Forth Valley and West Lothian Regional Improvement Collaborative. So our learning intentions for this session are to consolidate and support study skills for National 5 Business Management, to become more familiar with the course study. So our success criteria for today's session will be that you should be more confident in knowing what to study for the exam, and you can apply good structure to your answers as well. So at the start of March, the SQA offered guidance to different subjects on what may or may not come up in the exam, and this is what is for business management on the left hand side, that they have published broad topics that will or will not be in the exam, and that can really help you focus your revision so that you can be sure of what to study. So that's what we're going to go over today, is to have a look at what will come up in the exam. So during today's session, if you see any of these symbols, it will direct you to what you've got to do. So first of all, we'll just have a quick recap on what the exam looks like. So the exam will be on Wednesday the 18th of May at 9 AM till 11 o'clock, and that's obviously 2 hours, worth 90 marks, and it's worth 75% of your overall grade. So you may recall just submitting there an assignment, and that was worth 25% of your grade. So all of these topics will come up, and your questions will be generally split between them. And just a reminder that there are 2 case study questions, and then the rest of them are topic questions. So here's a list for understanding business, and what you can see is I've scaled it back. So just let you have a little time to digest that. We've got the role of business in society, types of businesses and organisations, objectives, external factors, and stakeholders. So it might be an idea to pause this and have a copy down or make a list so that you can make sure that you have got a checklist for this. Okay, the first thing that we're going to look at is the sectors of the economy. And in the last section, we looked at the difference between the sectors of the economy and sectors of industry. So all you need to remember that this time it's the sectors of the economy or business sectors that is coming up. And the first thing you might be asked to do is identify them. So if you remember back, identify the sectors of the economy, we are looking for private, public, and third. Next thing you might be asked to do would be to describe them. So the private sector, they're owned and controlled by private individuals, and their main aim would be to survive and make a profit. So for example, we've got sole traders partnerships and private limited companies. Then we've got the public sector, and they are owned and controlled by the government, and their main aim is to provide a service to the public. And they consist of local or national government organisations, like of the NHS or education or the fire brigade. They all exist mostly to provide the same level of service to the public in industries that are often not profitable or can be difficult to put a charge. Then the third sector are set up specifically to help a cause or provide services to members. So their main aim is to raise money or awareness for good causes. So you've got charities such as cancer research, social enterprises, such as the social bites or the big issue. And we've got volunteer organisations such as the Scouts, the Guides, or many local clubs. Now, the style of question that is quite common for the National 5 exam this time would be identify from the case study the sector of the economy that a particular business belongs to. So if that came up, in which case your answers would be the ones on the left-hand side under identify. Often quite common in the exam would be then to go and get a further mark for describing the sector, in which you would answer the ones up in the pink writing. So we're not going to do that question because we've not got the case study to look at. However, that's just to give you some hints and tips as to what to watch out for. Okay, now looking and focusing on the private sector businesses. First things first, we're going to look at sole traders. Now, it's quite common for you to be asked to compare different sectors, private sector businesses, in terms of ownership, control, finance. And then it's often that you're asked to give the advantages and disadvantages. So comparison questions come up quite a lot in this case. So we're going to go through them. A sole trader, first of all, is owned by one person. It is controlled by the owner, who makes all the decisions. It is financed through owner's savings, bank accounts and loans. The advantage is that you get to keep all the profits because you're running the business yourself. You make all the decisions and it's easy to set up. So you or I could just go and set up a sole trader right now. There's not a lot of legal paperwork involved. So it's the easiest type of business to set up. But the disadvantages would be that it has unlimited liability. As you're working by yourself, you have a heavy workload, unless you employ people, and it can be difficult to raise finance on your own. Now you can see here that I've got a little asterisk amongst unlimited liability. That's because you could go on to describe that further, and if you're asked to discuss being a sole trader, then you would get a development mark for unlimited liability. So just to recap, that unlimited liability means that if the business were to fail, you would have to be liable for all the debts of the business. So it means that you would have to pay back you would have to maybe sell your house or sell your belongings in order to pay for that debt. So we're going to come back to unlimited liability in just a minute. So you might be asked to, again, describe the features of, or you might be asked to discuss. So let's look at the next one, partnership. Partnerships are owned by between 2 and 20 partners. They are controlled by partners who usually have shared decision making. They are financed by partnership capital and bank loans. So instead of saying owner's savings, because you've got more than one savings, you could say owner's savings, or you could say that partnership capital. Now the advantages of this would be that it's easier to raise finance because you have got more people to invest in the business. So you might have to say £10,000 each to start, which is more than what you would if you had one person. Now, because you have got a partner, now remember a partner can be between 2 and 20, so you might have an array of skills bringing to the partnership so that you can be flexible in what you do. And that it's not just on you, your workload and your decision making is shared. However, disadvantages though, that partners also have unlimited liability. So if the business fails, they are liable to pay the debts of the business. The profit is shared between partners, as opposed to you having it on your own. If you brought in a partner, you'd have to give them a share of the profits. Disagreements can occur because many people may differ on how they want the business to run, which could affect the decision making of the business. And unlike a sole trader, which is relatively easy to set up, if you want to set up a partnership, you're more than likely, or you will be more than likely to be asked to set up a partnership agreement, which if you get lawyers to do it, it can be quite expensive. So just that's bear in mind. And the final thing that we're going to look at would be private limited companies. So private limited companies this time are owned by shareholders, and you have to be invited to buy a share in a private limited company. In other words, they're not available on the stock market. But you could set up a private limited company if you wanted to, because you have to have a minimum of 1 shareholder. It's controlled by a board of directors, and it is financed through selling shares and bank loans. So all of the finance are actually quite similar in the fact that you could get bank loans, but what is different between it is that you've got essentially more than 1 people investing in the business. So this time the advantages would be that the owner has limited liability rather than unlimited liability. So what that means is the owner will only lose what they invest in the business. So in this circumstance, you can consider the business and the owner to be separate legal entities. So the owner wouldn't need to necessarily sell personal belongings in order to pay for the debts of the business. So again, if you just said limited liability, you would get the mark. But if you went on to say more about it, then you would pick up a development mark should that question be in a discuss question. It's because you've got more than 1 person investing in the business through shareholders, you are more likely to raise capital. And in actual fact, the bigger you are, the tendency that the banks will agree to capital loans more, because the cost of the business is split, not just by 1 person. And the owner can retain control. This is kind of in comparison to what's called a public limited company, which means that anybody can buy a share. So if you just remember for now that the owner can retain control of the business. But the disadvantages is that it's going to be a costly and complicated legal setup. So businesses have got to, first of all, register with the Companies House or register, and it can be costly to set up because you've got to set up articles of association and memorandums of association, which essentially just outline the legal and procedures of a company. Don't really need to go into that. And obviously, because you've got more than 1 person, you must share your profits with shareholders. Now, this is potentially a good method for you revising. Sometimes it's quite good to have a table like this because you can quite clearly see all of the points that you could make. So having a look at some of the questions that you might get asked would be discuss the advantages and disadvantages of a partnership. Or it could be a sole trader, in which you would have a look at these ones. You might be asked to describe the features of a private limited company, in which you could answer about the ownership, control, finance of a private limited company. But because it's features, you may also add in advantages and disadvantages. The question that we're going to do now is compare a sole trader with a private limited company. So in which you would have a look at, again, the ownership, control, finance, and possibly some advantages and disadvantages. So that's a 4-mark question. So that should take you approximately 6 minutes. Okay, so we're going to go over the solutions now to that. And the last session we looked at good compare technique. So good compare technique, remember, has to get your point, you have to have two parts for a difference. But if it's a similarity, then you just need to have 1 point. Now the keywords that you would be looking to put in your answers here would be whereas, and it would also be both for a similarity. So let's have a look. From this table, the previous table, you should be able to answer this question. So a sole trader is owned by one person, whereas a private limited company is owned by shareholders. A sole trader is run by an individual or run by one person, whereas a private limited company is run by a managing director or a board of directors. So it's not acceptable at this stage to say more than one person. It's looking for you to give key information like a managing director or a board of director. Same with the previous point. A sole trader makes the decisions in a business, whereas a managing director or board of director, shareholders, make decisions in a private limited company. Sole traders have unlimited liability, whereas a private limited companies have limited liability. Both belong to the private sector of the economy. And you could say that in a private limited company, legal documents must be set up on forming the company. You could even specify that it is a memorandum of association and articles of association. However, you could just say legal documents and that would suffice. Whereas a sole trader does not require any formal paperwork, so it's relatively easy to set up. Okay, now just watch again with your phrasing that you don't on this occasion say isn't or doesn't. So, for example, if you were to say legal documents are required on forming a private limited company, whereas a sole trader doesn't, that's not enough. You need to give a little bit more to get your mark. Okay, so next we're going to go over internal factors, and this time we're going to show you the exam questions first, or the exam style questions first, and then we'll recap. So we're not going to do all of these questions, but you can see that it does often quite come up in the case study. So from the case study, identify 2 external factors. Then describe the impact that they have. Another question that came up said, describe the impact of external factors on a business. And you may be asked to also explain how the external factors affect a business. So we're going to recap on these. Okay, the next topic on our understanding business we're going to do is the external factors, or sometimes you might remember them as the PESTEC factors. If you can remember PESTEC, hopefully that will allow you to identify the different factors. So the P in PESTEC stands for political factors. So what have we got here? We've got a description first. So we've got a change in law, for example, a health and safety law. If that was to be implemented, that would affect the way your business would run. So you may have to train your staff. And we know that training staff could be expensive. So don't forget that if you make a point, you more often than not can get what's called a development point, which is when you go on to say a wee bit more about the point that you've made. In other words, you might have explained the point. Now, a business, if they don't adhere to those laws, then they could be breached. They could be fined or taken to court if they were breached, which could ultimately damage the reputation of the business. Another political factor could be the increase in minimum wage. And if the minimum wage was to increase, then obviously the production costs would rise. And when production costs rise, businesses have to make two decisions. They need to decide we're going to cut back on our expenses, so they may have to make staff redundant in order to pay for the rise, or they may have to increase their selling price so that they've got more money coming in. Another political factor could be increase or decrease in funding. And so, for example, the Scottish Government announced recently that there would be more funding for apprenticeships. So a good thing is about that for Scottish businesses is that some businesses will be able to then take on extra members of staff to grow their business. But likewise, if it was a decrease in funding, then it may prevent growth in certain areas. Other things that you could put in political factors could be like political instability. So you could talk about Brexit in this point and the fact that us leaving the EU has forced prices up. And that has an effect on a business because they've had to either increase their prices, and in most cases they have increased their prices, or taken a hit in profit. So next thing, the E in PESTEC stands for economic factors. And you could talk about there being a recession in the economy, or you could talk about there being a boom in the economy. But often recession is easier to remember because we're often in one. And the impact of a recession means that there will be a reduction in consumer spending. Because what basically happens is that during a recession, people don't have as much money, therefore they don't spend as much. You could talk also about unemployment. Now you could say an increase or decrease in unemployment. And again, that kind of leads back to the same point about reduction in consumer spending, that if you are unemployed, you're not going to have a disposable income, therefore you're not going to spend money on luxury items, so therefore a lot of the time businesses' sales decrease. And you can have what's called you could talk about a rise in inflation as well, and that means that the prices are rising over time, and that's what kind of happening at the moment. Is in the UK government we are seeing a rise in prices, and inflation is at quite a high point, and again that makes the cost of production increase. So for example, the cost of building a new house has gone up, so all the builders have had to do is they've had to increase their prices because they obviously want to have the same level of profit. Other economic factors you could talk about would be exchange rates, but these ones are one of the easier ones to talk about because we can relate to them a wee bit more. So we've got political factors, we've got economic factors, we have got So the S in the PESTEC factor stands for social factors. So what we're talking about here, we'd be talking about change in taste and fashion, the fact that our likes and dislikes change, and this may impact on a business because they may reduce sales if they don't keep up to date with them. So they may need to keep up to date with designs or invest in new product development. So say it was a fashion brand, if they don't keep up with the times, then people won't buy the product, and they might need to invest in trendy designers and pay a little bit more to keep their designs updated. Similarly, lifestyle changes, for example, there's a big increase in healthier living or veganism, and so businesses may need to change or adapt the recipes to bring out new versions so that they keep their customers. They keep their customers excited, or they actually gain new customers. So for example, there's a well-known supermarket stroke clothing brand. They have really expanded their meat-free vegan range, and what that has done is boosted sales and got new customers into the shop that maybe wouldn't have never shopped in that place before. The other thing to consider would be demographics, and a good example of that would be the aging population. So again, you've got to tailor your products to an aging population. So the T stands for technological, and here we are talking about advances in technology. Now you could just talk about advances in technology in general, or you can give some examples. So during the pandemic, businesses used a lot of video conferencing, and that was a good opportunity for those tech companies to boost sales. But similarly, some of the companies needed to do a wee bit more in terms of investment to get their technology up to scratch, and failure to do that, failure to not keep up to date, would be that you would leave competition behind. And obviously any developments that you do technological wise would be expensive to implement, so a business would have to think about that. You could talk about social media, for example. If you had an increase in social media or have new social media accounts, then that can increase your customer awareness. It can also increase your engagement with customers. And then finally, on the technological side, you could talk about e-commerce, which is when you give a facility to sell online, giving the potential to reach more customers worldwide, and you can operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The next E stands for environmental. Now you could split that into two things. You could talk about the weather, and if you remember the beast from the east, that was a really good example of how it impacted on business, because staff were not able to get in and sales decreased as a result, because many of the businesses had to close, so that they lost a lot of trading. However, similarly that day, that it did boost internet sales because people couldn't get into the shops. They did a lot of online shopping. Next, in the environmental, you could talk about the green credentials, for example, investment in green energy or recycling. And that impacts on a business because you may need to invest in renewable energy, which is expensive. However, it could be cheaper in the long run. And the business may need to recycle more or invest more in recycling facilities. Then the last one is the competitive. And what we're talking about there is that you've got to make sure that you're keeping up with what your competitors are doing. So if your competitors are lowering prices, then you may have to lower prices in order to make sure that you don't lose out on sales. So an impact of that would be that you might have to offer something different or lose out on sales. Okay, now we're on to the management of marketing. And these are all the topics that will be covered in management of marketing. So again, if you want to copy this or write down or make a checklist or make a mind map, do that now and you can come back to the video. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to look at for product under marketing would be product development. So to give you some questions, we have got either outline the stages involved in new product development or describe the stages involved in new product development. Now, the last day that we did look at, we looked at the difference between outline and describe. So outline is when you give just a brief statement, and describe is when you give a fuller account. So we're going to go through this. Okay, so to give you a helping hand here, we've got a good acronym, GAPTAP. So let's have a look. If we were to ask to identify, then the G stands for generate ideas, analyze ideas, produce a prototype, then you would test the product, alter the product, and produce the product. So these answers would be suitable for the first question on the previous slide. However, they may test your deeper understanding in which they would ask you to describe them. So if we're talking about describing generating ideas, you would come up with ideas for a product. Then you would analyze the ideas, whether you would work, and you would work out whether these ideas would work. You might give a list of pros and cons. You might do some research into the feasibility of these working out. Then you would produce what's called a prototype, and a prototype is a working model of the product. So say, for example, that you were manufacturing fizzy water and you had a new flavour of water. A prototype would be a make-up of that, including what the designs might look like for the bottle. Or if it's a technical product, it would be an almost finished version of the phone or the music device that you were looking for. Then you would test the product, and that one means seeing if the product works. You would maybe ask customers for feedback at that point. Then you would alter the product, which means that you would make changes to the product based on tests and feedback. And finally, produce the product, which means manufacture the product, start making it. Now these stages all happen before the product is launched into the market, if you're talking about the product life cycle. Now the last session we looked at, if you forget GAPTAP, but you remember all of the steps, if in doubt, leave the label out. So effectively, you could skip a step for describe and just describe the pink descriptions there. So this is a good way. A mind map is another good technique that you could use in order to revise. Okay, now we're going to look at another popular question in the exam about branding. Now we're going to work on explain the benefits to branding for an organisation. And this has come up a few times, and it could potentially be a 4-mark question. Now just a recap from the last session, we looked at explain, but we'll do it again because explain is one of the trickier ones that quite a lot of people get confused at. So explain the benefits to branding for an organisation. You have to give a detailed response as to why and how something may hinder or benefit. In other words, you're given a description plus reasons why. So we're looking out here for the benefits of branding, but then also saying why these benefits are a benefit. We're looking for two parts to your answer. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to look at is branding. Now here in the middle we have a very well-known brand in my school only, but I can't use any other coffee manufacturers for legal reasons. But imagine this was a very well-known coffee shop. Well, the first thing that you notice that it has got a logo, and logos and brands are instantly recognizable. You can pick them out between two coffee brands on a shelf with the hope that the customers would buy it. And brands can also charge higher prices as opposed to your local coffee shop that nobody's heard of before. So people are willing to pay more for the fancy coffee brands than your local cafe. Now, they do have a perception of quality. People think that it is often better quality than your average coffee shop, if we're talking about coffee branding. And as a result, people become brand loyal. So there's some people that will only go to certain coffee shops. And therefore, it is easier to launch new products on the back of that, because people trust the brand and they are willing to try other products. Say, for example, a well-known coffee brand started doing instant cool drinks. They're going to be an instant hit because people trust the brand. And often these brands can advertise global rather than, because they're advertising a brand, they can focus on the brand rather than just like have one product. Now these are advantages of branding, but more often than not you might be asked to explain them. So why are brands instantly recognizable, or the advantages of them being instantly recognizable? Well, first of all, it should encourage customers to buy the product because they are seen as familiar. They're recognized. You know it. You know what it stands for, so you trust it. Therefore, businesses benefit from increased sales. And because people know about it, they buy it, they can reduce your advertising costs. So you don't need to spend millions of pounds advertising on television. So if I'm going back to coffee shops again, because it's my favourite topic at the moment, the well-known coffee shops don't need to advertise. They don't need to advertise because they have taken time to build up their brand, and they do need to advertise, but they don't need to advertise as big as businesses that are just starting up. So I've said before that they can charge higher prices. If you charge higher prices, that means you're raking in the money. You can make bigger profits. And brands like these have got a perception of quality. And again, if you perceive something to be better quality, you as an individual are going to pay more for it. So you can charge higher prices. And then because they've got an image of quality, then they are more likely to get a good image from it. Many customers become brand loyal. And again, brand loyalty would mean that you can increase your prices and people will pay for them. Customers come back time and time and time again, so you build up a really big customer base and hopefully increase market share. And then because you're brand loyal to a company, you're more likely to try new products as they come out. Which leads us on to the next point, which means it's easier to launch new products because the trust is built up there. So if you launch a new product, you're almost guaranteed that people will buy it based on the opinions of others. And the final point that I've got there would be that you can advertise global rather than product focus, which means that you would have lower advertising in the long run. Okay, so these are the topics of management of operations. We look at suppliers, inventory management, methods of production, quality, and ethical and environmental. Now again, you might want to pause this video at this point so you can have a look, make a checklist, make a mind map. Okay, so now we're going to go over inventory management, and these are some of the questions that you might get asked to do. Draw and label the inventory control diagram, which we're going to go over. Describe the advantages of computerized stock control, and then we've also got some defining questions there as well. So you might want to pause this at this point so that you can attempt it first before we go over it. If you wanted to do these questions, that would take approximately 10 to 12 minutes for you to do that. Okay, so what I would like you to do at this stage is to draw this diagram into your jotters or a whiteboard or somewhere. So this is the inventory control diagram, and you would be expected to draw this in the exam. So first of all, just explaining about that, a business will need to manage its inventory, and inventory is just another word for stock. And they've got to make sure that they have got enough because they don't want to run out, because customers will be unhappy. But they also don't want to have too much, because if you hold on to too much stock, then you have to obviously pay for it. And the more stock that you have that's not sold is not going to be profitable. So in order to do this, a business has what's called an inventory control diagram or a system. It's kind of often it's linked to a database. Anyway, what happens is that they monitor the stock or inventory and keep track of it. And so this is what it looks like. So as an activity, first of all, once you've drawn the diagram, see if you can have a go at labelling it. That should take approximately 10 minutes. Alright, so the first thing that we can look at is the axes. We're measuring stock level or inventory level, and we're doing this over time. So over time, we are measuring our inventory level. Now, the first thing that we want to do is set what's called a maximum inventory. Now, a maximum inventory is the highest level of stock that you should hold on to with minimizing costs. So obviously, the more stock that you hold on to, the more that you're going to have to pay for storage, you're going to have to pay for security, you're going to have to pay for insurance. And also, the more stock that you have, the more susceptible you are for it to be going off or out of date. So a business would take into account all of that, and they would set a maximum stock level. Then they would set what's called a minimum stock level, which is the lowest inventory that a business will stock. And this will take into consideration things like usage and how long it takes to get delivered. And a business does never want to go below this, because then they are at risk of running out of stock, having shortages. And that's not great, because customers will be unhappy if they run out of stock. So a business would set a minimum inventory level. Then what they would do is that they would set a point in which to reorder stock. And that's what's called the reorder level. So that is the point at which that they need to reorder stock. And it will take into consideration like how long it will take for new stock to arrive. And they will also take into consideration how fast they use the stock. So the next thing that they will look at is we're going to look at the shape of the diagram. So now over time, businesses will use stock. So it goes down in a diagonal line like this. So the point here, the point where the diagonal line crosses with the reorder level, that triggers an order. And at that point, that is when stock is ordered. You don't get it instantly because it takes a while to arrive. So that's why the diagonal line goes a lot further down to the inventory, the minimum inventory. And then as soon as it reaches the minimum inventory, you get your order, and then the stock level will be replenished back up to the maximum inventory level. And this will keep on going over time. And that is how you get the shape. And the shape looks like an N. So I've got a wee down for you. It's like an N over and over again. So if you remember anything, remember that the inventory control diagram is shaped like an N. Now, if you're asked to draw this in the exam, most often than not, you would get a 4-mark question, or just to like fill it in here that the lead time is the time it takes from placing an order from your reorder level to when you get it, and that is the lead time. The other thing to note before I give you the marks is that the difference between the maximum inventory and the minimum inventory is your reorder quantity, which is how much stock you have ordered. Okay, so you get, in the exam, you would get 1 mark for a shape. So you get a mark for that, doing that N over and over again. And it's important that you get that right, because if you get it around the wrong way, unfortunately, we can't give you the mark. You get 1 mark for labeling both of the axes. So if you only had inventory level there and you didn't have time, I'm sorry, you wouldn't get a mark. And then you get a further 2 marks from the correct labels. So you could pick maximum inventory, minimum inventory, and you would get 2 marks. You wouldn't get a further mark for talking about reorder level. But if you were to get minimum wrong, say for example you got the wrong word, you could pick it up there. Okay, so just to recap, if you have a little pause the video and see if you can challenge yourself to filling out that, you might be asked to describe the terms. Okay, so if you've had a chance to have a look at that, the maximum stock level is the highest level of stock that a business will hold in order to minimize costs. The minimum stock level, this is the lowest level of stock that a business should not fall below in order to ensure there are no shortages and production grinds to a halt. So you don't want that to happen because customers will be unhappy. The reorder level is when the stock should be ordered in order to avoid it dropping below minimum levels. And the reorder quantity is the amount of stock that is ordered to bring back to minimum level. And lead time is the time it takes from order to delivery. So So if you were asked to define these terms, these would be good descriptions. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about there, just because it's added on, is computerized inventory control. Now, a business may also decide to use computerized inventory control, and it's usually linked to like a database system. You might see it associated with what's called electronic point of sale. Now, if you store these things on a database allows you to do the following. You can check the system to find out the inventory levels. So if it's linked to a database, you would look up the computer, possibly even scan a barcode, and it would help you save from physically checking the inventory. So in other words, it would stop you from having to do a stock check. Say for example, you were in a clothing shop, you wanted to find out if there was a pair of jeans size 12, instead of the sales assistant actually looking and physically checking to see whether or not it's in stock, they would go onto the database to check the inventory levels. Now, as you know the stock levels at times, then it should avoid you from overstocking and understocking. The customers would get accurate information if they know the inventory levels. And it can be linked to the suppliers to order goods. It might automatically flag up like a reorder. At the reorder point, it would automatically go to suppliers. And also the best sellers and non-movers can be identified because on the system it normally tells you when the last item was sold. And if you were to do that on a national scale in like local shops, then it would help managers make decisions as to what to stock the next time. Okay, next we're going to look at management of people. And again, you can pause the presentation so that you can have a look at this. We're going to go over training, and some of the questions that you might get asked would be to describe the methods of training an organisation could use, identify the method a business uses to train its staff, followed by describe the advantages of this method. You might be asked to explain, and you might be asked to discuss. So again, you could do these in your own time to have a practice. We're going to recap on training. So the three types of training that we have got are induction training, on-the-job training, and off-the-job training. Now these descriptions are all modelled up, so see if you can put them in the correct place. Okay, so we have got induction training, on-the-job training and off-the-job training, and these should now be put into the correct place. So induction training is when new employees are trained when they first start. They're usually given on training on health and safety procedures. They may be given training on where the staff room is, company policies and procedures. On-the-job training is when you're trained in the workplace whilst carrying out a job, and it could be done by shadowing the colleague or learning things to a specific job. And off-the-job training is when you're trained away from the workplace, which could be done at a training centre, and it's usually experts that complete the training or deliver the training. So now we're going to look at a compare and discuss. And again, you could use something similar to this to help guide your revision. If you compare and discuss at the same time, then you're hitting all avenues. So let's have a look at on-the-job training. On-the-job training is cheaper to train as it's done in-house. You're not having to go anywhere. Whereas off-the-job training, it's more expensive as training courses have a cost. So for example, if you're sent away, it might cost you to travel and it might cost you for food, as well as paying the trainer. The good thing about on the job is work completed whilst being trained. However, off the job training is that production time is lost due to training courses because you're away from the workplace. Good thing is about on the job training is that it's tailored to the needs of this specific job. Whereas in off the job training, it may not be completely relevant to the job. They may focus on other things other than pertaining to your job. The organisation may pick up bad habits from colleagues, however, whereas off the job training is delivered by experts, so the quality of the training is more likely to be higher. And on the job training, the quality of the training may not be as good because, again, you're not necessarily being trained by a qualified person. Whereas off the job training, you've got higher levels of concentration because you've not got any distractions at work. Now you can see here, we've done a compare question. However, sometimes it's quite good to colour code your work so that you could pick out the advantages and disadvantages as well, just in case you get asked to compare either of the two and discuss either of the two. So here, whilst we have done a compare question, we have got 3 advantages and 2 disadvantages. We're on the job training, and we've got 2 advantages and 3 disadvantages of off the job training. So we've got training in general, would be another question that may come up, and let's have a quick recap of that. So again, this time we're using colour coded to look at the advantages and disadvantages. Now, if you have been trained, there's going to be less accidents and waste in the production process because you know what you're doing. And you could talk about staff motivation. So staff are going to be more motivated in their work because they know what to do, and also they have had a little bit of investment in. And if you feel invested in as an employee, you're more likely to stay with the company. So that's what's talking about staff retention. If you're motivated, you're going to be more productive. So that means that more work is completed. You might complete work to a better quality standard, which then ultimately would lead to improved customer satisfaction. So again, that's one of the answers for in customer satisfaction would be that so the ways to improve that would be to train your staff. And your staff are more flexible because they can do more. They've been trained, they can do a variety of things, which makes them very versatile and flexible, which means that they can cover for staff absences. Disadvantages, though, obviously the costs of training are going to be expensive. It is time consuming because production is going to be lost because a member of staff is on their training course, and if they are loss of production, then it means loss of sales that day. As is always the case, if you've been trained and have got more qualifications, then you're more likely to demand higher wages. And staff may leave for jobs out with the organisation. So once they have got their qualifications or been trained, then they may have a danger to leave the organisation. So those are some of those questions covered in general. And last but not least, here's the finance topics that are going to be covered. So again, you can pause this, write a checklist. Okay, and the last topic that we're going to look at would be cash budgets. Now, it's quite common for you to be able to be asked to do a simple calculation you're not expected to do everything, but it might be just a calculation like this. So have a go at completing A, B, C, and D answers. Okay, and welcome back. So before looking at the answers, just to let you know that like a cash budget, if you reminder that a cash budget is prepared for the future. And it is prepared for the future to, first of all, avoid you overspending in the first place. So a cash budget is prepared for the future and it shows the forecasted income or receipts, outgoings, which are the payments of a business. So you can say there this is a cash budget for green energy solutions and it's May, June, July, so it's prepared in advance. Now it's used to help us plan for the future. Because it is prepared for the future, we can help use it to make decisions. And we'll have a look at the decisions that we'll look in a minute. But it can highlight a surplus. And a surplus is when you have more money coming in, so it's positive, you've got a positive balance. And if you can identify the month or the months that you have got surplus, then it helps you plan for the expenditure. So when would be the appropriate month to invest in machinery, for example. It can also, though, the opposite of a surplus is a deficit, and that is when you have more money going out than coming in. Obviously, you don't want that. And it's because it's prepared for the future, you can rectify that. So you can decide to plan ahead. If you, in a particular month, were going to be in a deficit, then you could arrange an overdraft or arrange a loan to get around that. Or you could cut back on expenses. So it helps identify where spending might be high so that you can cut down. But it can also be used to set targets as well for individual departments, so then they know, okay, we've got to cut back by 10% or we've got to increase our sales. Okay, so I asked you at the start to calculate the value of A, B, and C. Hopefully we'll reveal it. So A was 20,000. And again, you had to work back the way for this one. In a lot of the questions, you do have a little bit of problem solving to do. So the total receipts were 22,000. You had sales of 2,000, so it means that you had to start with 20,000. Now what happens here is that you would add up all your payments and you deduct it from your total receipts, and that gave you a negative figure of 3,000. And because that was the closing balance of May, the closing balance of May always becomes the opening balance of the next month, which means that June was also negative 3,000. The value of C was all of the payments added up, which was 7,000. 7,000 is taken away from 5,000 is minus 2,000, which is a deficit. So if you see anything in brackets, that means it's a negative figure. So sometimes it might not be a negative shown, but it might be shown in brackets. It just means take away or a negative. And D, the closing balance then was 2,500. Okay, so other questions that you might get asked would be, from the cash budget, identify 2 cash flow problems and describe how the problems identified in part A could be solved. Now, there are only so many ways that they can ask you this question, and there's only so many increases or decreases that they can do. So I'm going to show you, having a look at this. The first thing that you should notice, or a problem, is that wages are increasing. Sorry, purchases are increasing. Then the next problem would be that wages are increasing. Things are getting more expensive. Another problem here is that you have purchased a motor van. Now you might be wondering, okay, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but because you have made a purchase of the motor van of £20,000, that has given you a deficit in May of £3,000. You've also got a deficit in June. So those are the problems that you could have had in this circumstance. And then the thing now that you've got to do is that you've got to identify solutions to the problem. So if your purchases are increasing, then you need to cut back on purchases, and you might decide, I'm going to find a cheaper supplier. You might negotiate discounts for bulk buying or prompt payment, just to get that figure down a wee bit. To get the wages down, you might decide to cut overtime or cut the number of workers needed. Don't say fire workers, but you might want to reduce them. You might want to reduce overtime, or you could give them a reduction in pay. Now, when you're purchasing the motor van, let's just say you needed it. Instead of purchasing it outright, you could hire a van or hire it, and then that would allow you to spread the payments over the months rather than have that one big lump sum of 20,000. You could arrange an overdraft if you've got a closing balance, so that's 3,000. If you had an overdraft, that means that it would take you up, or you could get a loan. And you could take out a loan to boost the receipts to have more money coming in. Now, you may also be asked to, and it's not in this case, because in this case the sales are increasing, but in the occasion that the sales were reducing, then you could also figure out a ways of increasing your sales. So perhaps putting the selling prices up, or arranging a sale to shift the stock. You could have some advertising campaigns in order to get your sales boosted. Okay, just to have a quick review of our learning, that is us at the end of this session. And just a reminder that the exam is on the 18th of May at 9 AM to 11 AM, so that's 2 hours. Just also a reminder that the SQA issued a revision guide at the start of March, which is also in this presentation, which you can go and have a look at again to revisit. And also what we've done this session is that we've covered some of the trickier topics and popular topics coming up in the exam using past paper questions. So thank you for listening. And just to look at your next steps, you'll be looking at doing past paper questions on the SQA website to further practice questioning for the exam. All the best and good luck for the National 5 Business Management exam.